The story begins not on a battlefield, but in the cold stone chambers of Thebes, 30 years before Chaeronea. Young Philip, barely 15 years old, sat in his quarters, a political prisoner disguised as a guest. He was the third son of King Amyntas III of Macedonia, a kingdom the Greeks barely considered civilized. To the sophisticated Thebans, Macedonians were little more than mountain barbarians who spoke a strange dialect and worshipped their gods with too much wine and too little philosophy. The city of Thebes itself was a revelation to the young prince. Its walls stood higher and thicker than anything in Macedonia. Its agora bustled with merchants from across the Mediterranean, Phoenician traders selling purple dye, Egyptian merchants offering papyrus, Athenian craftsmen displaying pottery that seemed too fine for human hands to have made. The houses were built of stone rather than wood, with courtyards featuring fountains and gardens that demonstrated wealth Philip had never imagined. But what captivated Philip most was the military precision he witnessed daily. The Thebans trained their soldiers with a dedication that bordered on religious fervor. Every morning, he watched from his window as the Sacred Band assembled in the gymnasium. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were pairs of lovers, the older Erastes and younger Eromenos, bound not just by military discipline, but by the most powerful force the Greeks knew, eros, passionate love. The Theban theory was brutally simple. A man might flee to save his own life, but he would never flee and abandon his lover to death. The Sacred Band had proven this theory at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, where they had shattered the previously invincible Spartan army. Philip had heard the stories even in distant Macedonia, how 300 Theban lovers had held the Spartan right wing in place, while the oblique phalanx formation had crushed the Spartan left. Philip made it his mission to understand everything about Theban military success. He befriended younger members of the Sacred Band, learning their training regiments. He studied under the gymnasiarch, the master of the training grounds, absorbing lessons about physical conditioning, weapons handling, and unit cohesion. He attended philosophical discussions where Theban strategists debated the nature of warfare, courage, and tactical innovation. Most importantly, Philip studied Epaminondas, the general who had revolutionized Greek warfare. Epaminondas had invented the oblique phalanx formation, where you massively strengthened one wing of your army, even at the cost of weakening the other, and used that strengthened wing to punch through the enemy line. It violated traditional Greek warfare, which emphasized balance formations and frontal assaults, but it worked. Epaminondas had used it to destroy Spartans' military dominance and establish Thebes as the premier land power in Greece. Philip absorbed these lessons like a sponge absorbing water, but he also recognized Theban weaknesses. For all their military sophistication, Thebes was still just a city-state. Their army consisted of citizens who farmed or crafted during peacetime and fought only when war required. They couldn't maintain permanent military campaigns because their soldiers needed to return home for harvest. Their strategic thinking was limited to seasonal campaigns and defensive wars. Philip began to envision something different. An army of professionals who trained year-round, who owed loyalty to their king rather than their city, who could campaign continuously without worrying about harvest schedules. An army that combined Theban discipline with Spartan warrior culture and Macedonian mobility. An army that would make the citizen soldiers of the Greek city-states obsolete. But Philip was not wasting his captivity. Every day, he watched. He studied the Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite force of 300 warriors who trained together, fought together, and died together. He observed the legendary general Epaminondas, whose innovative oblique phalanx formation had shattered Spartan supremacy at Leuctra. Philip absorbed everything, Tactics, discipline, the art of siege warfare, the politics of Greek city-states, their alliances, and their endless, exhausting rivalries. 3 years later, when Philip returned to Macedonia, he carried with him a revolutionary vision. His homeland was in chaos. His eldest brother, Alexander II, had been assassinated. His second brother, Perdiccas III, wore the crown but struggled to hold the kingdom together. Barbarian tribes pressed from the north. The Illyrians raided from the west. Greek city-states meddled from the south, supporting pretenders to the throne. In 359 BC, disaster struck. Perdiccas led an army against the Illyrians and was killed, along with 4,000 Macedonian soldiers, nearly a quarter of the kingdom's fighting men. The kingdom teetered on the edge of collapse. Philip, now 23 years old, seized his moment. Officially serving as regent for his infant nephew, he moved with decisive speed. Within months, he had outmaneuvered rival claimants, bribed potential enemies, and consolidated power. By 356 BC, he was king in his own right. Philip understood what others did not. Macedonia's weakness was also its strength. Unlike the fractious Greek city-states, Macedonia could be unified under one authority. Unlike the democratic assemblies of Athens or Thebes, where every decision required debate and vote, Philip could act swiftly and decisively. He immediately set about transforming his rough warriors into a professional army. The Macedonian phalanx became Philip's masterpiece. He extended the traditional spear, the 8-foot dory, into the fearsome sarissa, a pike measuring 18 to 20 feet long. Soldiers wielded these weapons with both hands, creating a forest of spear points that extended far beyond the front rank. The first 5 ranks held their sarissas at different angles, creating an impenetrable wall of bronze and wood. Behind them, the rear ranks held their pikes vertically, ready to bring them down if the front ranks fell. But the phalanx was only one piece of Philip's military revolution. He organized the army into precise tactical units. The phalanx would pin the enemy in place like an anvil. Then his cavalry, the companion cavalry, drawn from Macedonian nobility, would strike like a hammer, smashing into the enemy's flank. He developed elite light infantry, the hypastis, who could fight in any terrain. He created siege engines that could break down city walls. He instituted constant training, rigorous discipline, and regular pay. Philip also possessed something the Greek city-states lacked: strategic patience. He didn't need quick victories to satisfy impatient assemblies or term-limited generals. He could plan campaigns that unfolded over years, not months. He could retreat when necessary, advance when opportune, and wait when wisdom demanded. More importantly, Philip understood that every military victory should serve a political purpose. After defeating enemies, he often incorporated their soldiers into his own army. He married women from rival kingdoms. He would eventually have 7 wives, creating networks of alliance across the Balkans. He used gold from newly captured mines to bribe potential opponents. "No fortress is impregnable," he famously said, "if a donkey, laden with gold, can climb its walls." By the late 350s BC, Philip had secured Macedonia's borders and was looking south. The Greek city-states watched with growing alarm. Athens, the cultural and commercial powerhouse, saw Macedonia as a threat to its grain supply from the Black Sea. Thebes, the dominant military power in central Greece, viewed Philip's expansion as a challenge to its hegemony. Sparta, though diminished, still nursed dreams of past glory.
In 356 BC, the same year Philip took the throne, 3 momentous events occurred. His general, Parmenion, defeated the Illyrians. His horse won at the Olympic Games, and his wife Olympias gave birth to a son, Alexander. The boy grew up in his father's war camps, watching armies maneuver, listening to generals debate strategy. Philip ensured Alexander received the finest education. eventually hiring Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the age, as his tutor. But Alexander learned more than philosophy. He learned warfare. He learned leadership. He learned his father's most important lesson, that Macedonia's destiny lay not in the northern mountains, but in the glittering cities of Greece and beyond. As Alexander approached manhood, Philip's ambitions crystallized. He would do what no one had done before, unite all of Greece under Macedonian leadership, not through temporary alliances that would fracture at the first crisis, but through definitive conquest. The Greek city-states would bend their knee to Macedonia, and together they would turn east toward the wealthy Persian Empire. But first, he needed a decisive victory, one so overwhelming that Greek resistance would crumble. He needed a battle that would echo through the ages. The opportunity came in 339 BC, wrapped in the religious politics that perpetually plagued Greece. The Amphictyonic League, a religious association controlling the sacred shrine at Delphi, declared a sacred war against the city of Amphissa. Philip maneuvered himself into position as the league's champion. It was a brilliant political stroke. He could march his army into central Greece under the banner of religious duty. The Greek city-states saw through the pretense immediately. Athens and Thebes, ancient rivals who had fought each other for generations, performed a diplomatic miracle. They allied against the common Macedonian threat. The great Athenian orator Demosthenes, who had spent years warning about Philip's ambitions, finally convinced his fellow citizens that the one-eyed king from the north represented an existential danger to Greek freedom. In the summer of 338 BC, the allied Greek army assembled near the town of Chaeronea in Boeotia. They numbered around 35,000 men, 20,000 from Athens and Thebes, plus contingents from Corinth, Megara, and smaller city-states. They took position on a plain flanked by hills and anchored their line against the natural fortifications of the terrain. Philip marched south with 32,000 soldiers, slightly outnumbered, but this didn't concern him. He had fought outnumbered before. His men were professional warriors who had campaigned together for years. The Greeks faced him with citizen soldiers, many seeing battle for the first time. On the Greek right flank stood the Thebans, including the legendary Sacred Band, those same elite warriors he had studied in his youth. On the left stood the Athenians, manning their traditional position of honor. Between them stretched the allied center, a mix of hoplites from various city-states. Philip positioned his phalanx in the center and left. On his right wing, he placed an elite cavalry unit, and leading that cavalry was his 18-year-old son, Alexander, commanding troops in a major battle for the first time. The stage was set. Dawn would bring the battle that would determine Greece's future. How do you defeat an army that refuses to break?
The morning of the battle broke clear and hot, the kind of August day when bronze armor becomes an oven and thirst becomes torture. Soldiers on both sides made their final preparations. They checked their weapons, tightened their armor straps, and cast nervous glances toward the enemy lines. Some prayed to Ares, god of war. Others to Athena, goddess of wisdom in battle. A few simply stared at the ground, contemplating mortality. Philip moved among his troops with the ease of a man completely in his element. His single eye scanned his battle line, checking positions, offering encouragement. He had fought in dozens of battles, suffered wounds that would have killed lesser men, including the injury that cost him his right eye, and he approached warfare with the confidence of a master craftsman. Today, he told his commanders, we don't just win a battle, we win Greece. Across the plain, the Greek commanders faced a more complex task. Athenian generals, Theban generals and representatives from allied cities debated strategy by committee. They had numbers on their side, perhaps a slight advantage. They held strong defensive ground, but they lacked unified command. Each contingent ultimately answered to its own city's leaders. Demosthenes, the Athenian orator, stood among the Athenian ranks, suited in armor. For years, he had warned Athens about Philip through his speeches, his famous Philippics. Now he would fight in the battle his words had helped provoke. The Sacred Band, those 300 Theban warriors, stood ready on the right wing, their reputation preceding them like a warrior's shadow. They had never been defeated, never broken, never fled. The battle began with the traditional exchange of missiles, arrows, javelins, sling stones arcing across the morning sky. Then the phalanxes began their advance, a terrible synchronized movement accompanied by the rhythmic crash of bronze shields against bronze greaves, creating a noise like rolling thunder. The Macedonian phalanx on the left engaged the Athenian right, shields locked, spears thrust. Men in the front ranks pushed, crushed against each other, stabbing at any exposed flesh. Those in the rear pushed forward, adding their weight to the deadly scrum. This was the otismos, the push, ancient warfare at its most brutal and claustrophobic. But something unexpected happened. The Macedonians began to retreat. At first, it seemed like a rout. Philip's left wing fell back slowly, step by careful step. The Athenians, smelling victory, pushed forward with renewed vigor. Their generals shouted encouragement. "They're breaking! Push forward! Drive them into the sea!" The line began to stretch. Gaps opened in the Greek formation as the Athenians surged forward, pursuing what they believed was a fleeing enemy. Discipline, so carefully maintained at the battle's start, began to fray. Young Athenian soldiers, tasting their first victory, broke ranks to chase the retreating Macedonians. But Philip wasn't retreating. He was dancing. The feigned retreat was one of the oldest tricks in warfare, yet it worked because it appealed to the most basic human instincts, the exhilaration of victory, the desire to pursue a fleeing enemy. Philip had planned this from the start. His veteran soldiers executed the maneuver perfectly, maintaining formation even as they withdrew, drawing the Athenians further and further from their defensive positions. On the opposite end of the battlefield, Alexander was ready. Alexander was ready to move out. The young prince sat astride his horse Bucephalus, a massive black stallion that only Alexander could ride, at the head of the companion cavalry. Around him were 2,000 of Macedonia's finest horsemen, drawn from the kingdom's nobility. They had trained together since childhood. They trusted Alexander, despite his youth, because he possessed his father's tactical brilliance combined with a personal charisma that inspired absolute loyalty. Alexander watched the Athenian line extend. He saw the gaps opening. He saw the moment. "Now," he shouted, and drove his heels into Bucephalus's flanks. The companion cavalry exploded forward like a bronze thunderbolt. 2,000 horses and riders charged in a wedge formation, Alexander at the point, directly at the weakened joint between the Greek center and the Theban right wing. The ground shook with the hammer of hooves. Dust rose in a choking cloud. The cavalry crashed into the Greek line with devastating force. Ancient cavalry didn't fight like medieval knights with lances and heavy armor. They were shock troops who used speed, surprise, and concentrated force to break enemy formations. Alexander's cavalry wielded short spears and swords, stabbing down at infantry, using their horses' mass to bowl over defenders, creating chaos and terror. The Greek center crumbled. Soldiers who moments before had stood in disciplined ranks suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against mounted warriors who appeared from nowhere, striking from unexpected angles. The formation collapsed into a mass of individual struggles. But the Sacred Band held. On the Greek right, Thebes' elite warriors maintained their position even as the rest of the line disintegrated.
They stood in their ranks, shields locked, spears leveled, refusing to yield. These were men who had sworn oaths to stand together, to never retreat, to die in place rather than abandon their positions. They formed a circle, shields outward, and prepared to sell their lives dearly. Alexander personally led the assault. The young prince fought in the front ranks, his courage inspiring the Macedonians to feats of desperate valor. The battle around the Sacred Band became a terrible grinding slaughter. Macedonians attacked from all sides. Thebans defended from all sides. The circle contracted as men fell, but it never broke. For hours, the Sacred Band fought. As the afternoon sun climbed towards its zenith, the circle grew smaller. Wounded men took the places of dead men. The ground became slick with blood. Still, they fought. Finally, as the sun began its descent, the last of the Sacred Band fell. Not one had fled. Not one had surrendered. They died where they stood, in formation, true to their oaths. When Philip surveyed the battlefield that evening, he came upon the bodies of the Sacred Band piled in their circular formation. According to historical accounts, he wept. He said, "Let no one speak ill of these men." They believed they were doing something honorable. The Battle of Chaeronea was over. The casualties were staggering. Over 2,000 Greeks dead, including most of the Sacred Band, versus perhaps 300 Macedonians. Thousands more Greeks were captured. Athens and Thebes lay defenseless. Greece itself was at Philip's mercy. The age of the independent Greek city-state had ended. The age of Macedonia had begun. What happens when victory is so complete that it births unforeseen consequences?
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The evening after the battle, Philip hosted a celebratory symposium, a drinking party, in his tent. Wine flowed freely as Macedonian officers toasted their king and their victory. The mood was jubilant, almost ecstatic. They had achieved what many thought impossible. They had defeated the combined might of Athens and Thebes in open battle. Philip, drunk on wine and victory, donned a crown and began dancing through the battlefield, mocking the captured Athenian prisoners. He sang parodies of Demosthenes' speeches, the famous Philippics that had denounced him as a barbarian threat to Greek civilization. "Philip, son of Amyntas, from Macedonia, a place that once you couldn't even buy a decent slave," he jeered, referencing Demosthenes' actual words back at their author. Among the prisoners forced to watch this spectacle sat the Athenian orator Demades. Despite being a captive himself, he possessed the courage to speak. "O king," he called out, "fortune has cast you in the role of Agamemnon, yet you played the part of Thersites." The reference cut through Philip's drunken haze like a knife through silk. In Homer's Iliad, Agamemnon was the noble king who led the Greeks against Troy. Thersites was a common soldier, ugly and mocking, who was beaten for his insolence. Demades was telling Philip that he was acting beneath his station, that he was behaving like a barbarian rather than the civilized conqueror he claimed to be. Philip froze. The tent fell silent. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Philip's face changed. The drunken mockery vanished, replaced by something more calculating, more dangerous, or perhaps wiser. He said, "You're right." He removed his crown and ordered wine brought for the prisoners. The king, who moments before had been dancing in drunken triumph, now became the statesman who would shape Greece's future. This moment encapsulates the complexity of Philip's character. He could be brutal. He had killed countless enemies, destroyed cities, enslaved populations, Yet he could also show restraint and political wisdom. Unlike his Greek contemporaries, who viewed warfare as an extension of politics but treated defeated enemies harshly, Philip understood that permanent conquest required eventually turning enemies into allies. In the days following Chaeronea, Philip demonstrated this philosophy. Against all expectations, he treated defeated Athens with remarkable clemency. He could have sacked the city, enslaved its population, and burned it to the ground, the traditional fate of defeated enemies in ancient warfare. Instead, he returned captured Athenians without ransom. He allowed Athens to keep its democracy, its laws, and even its navy. He asked only that Athens join the Macedonian alliance and abandon its opposition to his rule. Why? Athens controlled nothing of military value. Chaeronea had proven that. But Athens controlled something far more important: legitimacy. Athens was the cultural capital of the Greek world, the home of Pericles and Socrates, of Sophocles and Aeschylus, of democracy and philosophy. By showing mercy to Athens, Philip transformed himself from a foreign conqueror into a protector of Greek civilization. Thebes received harsher treatment. He installed a Macedonian garrison in the city. He exiled or executed leaders of the anti-Macedonian faction. He dissolved the Bosian League that Thebes had dominated. The Sacred Band was gone, and with it, Thebes' military power. Yet, even here, Philip stopped short of complete destruction. Thebes would survive, diminished, but intact. The other Greek city-states capitulated really quickly. Corinth, Megara, and the Peloponnesian cities sent delegations pledging loyalty. Only Sparta, nursing memories of past glory, refused to join Philip's alliance. Philip, recognizing that crushing Sparta would be costly and unnecessary, simply bypassed them, leaving the Spartans to their splendid isolation. In 337 BC, Philip convened a congress at Corinth and established the League of Corinth. All Greek city-states except Sparta joined. The League's charter guaranteed each city's autonomy in internal affairs, while placing foreign policy and military matters under collective, which meant Macedonian, control. Philip was elected hegemon, supreme commander of the League's combined forces. But the League's true purpose wasn't to govern Greece. It was to mobilize Greece for war against Persia. For 2 centuries, Persia had loomed over Greece like a perpetual threat. The Persian Wars of 410 and 480 BC had entered Greek legend. Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea. Every Greek schoolboy knew the stories. Though Persia no longer threatened Greece militarily, it meddled constantly in Greek politics, using gold and diplomacy to maintain Greek disunity and prevent any single power from dominating. Philip planned to turn the tables. He would unite Greece, invade Persia, and plunder the legendary wealth of the East. It was brilliant strategy. A common external enemy would unite the fractious Greeks under Macedonian leadership, and Persian gold would fund future conquests. In 336 BC, Philip sent an advance force of 10,000 men across the Hellespont into Asia Minor under generals Parmenion and Attalus. The invasion of Persia had begun. Philip would follow with the main army in the spring. But Philip never made that crossing. In the summer of 336 BC, Philip arranged the wedding of his daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus, Olympia's brother. The ceremony took place at Aegae, the ancient Macedonian capital. Representatives from across Greece attended, recognizing this as a display of Philip's power and prestige. The celebrations included athletic competitions, theatrical performances, and elaborate processions. On the morning of the wedding ceremony, Philip entered the theater at Aegae. He walked surrounded by his bodyguards, but had ordered them to keep their distance. He wanted the assembled Greeks to see him as a friend and ally, not a conqueror requiring military protection. He wore a white cloak and a crown of laurels. At 46 years old, he stood at the height of his power. King of Macedonia, hegemon of Greece, conqueror of Thebes and Athens, poised to invade the Persian Empire. A young man stepped from the crowd. His name was Pausanias, a member of Philip's elite bodyguard, one of the 7 bodyguards who had sworn to protect the king with their lives. He approached Philip as if to speak, then his hand moved, and suddenly he held a sword. Before anyone could react, Pausanias drove the blade into Philip's ribs through his white cloak, piercing his heart. Philip collapsed. Blood spread across his white garment like red wine on marble. The greatest military commander of his age died not on a battlefield, but in a theater, killed not by a foreign enemy, but by one of his own sworn protectors. Chaos erupted. Pausanias ran. Several of Philip's bodyguards pursued him. According to some accounts, they killed him immediately. Others say that he tripped and fell and was then executed. Either way, he died before he could be questioned about his motives or whether he had accomplices. Why did Pausanias kill Philip? The ancient sources offer a murky story involving personal grievances, sexual relationships, and insults to honor. Philip had allegedly wronged Pausanias in some personal matter, refused to grant him justice, and Pausanias had stewed in resentment until he decided on revenge. But some historians, then and now, suspected a deeper conspiracy. Did Olympia, Philip's wife, play a role? She had been marginalized when Philip took another wife, and she had a son whose inheritance might have been threatened. Did Persian Bold pay for the assassination? Did Athenian patriots, still bitter over Chaeronea, arrange Philip's death? We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Philip's death created a crisis. The League of Corinth was held together by Philip's personal
authority and military reputation. With Philip dead, would the Greek city-states remain loyal, or would they see an opportunity to rebel? Would the Macedonian nobles accept the succession, or would civil war tear the kingdom apart? Would the Persian invasion proceed or collapse into chaos? Everything hinged on what happened next. Everything depended on the young man who now inherited his father's throne, his father's army, and his father's unfinished invasion. Everything depended on Alexander. The prince who had led the cavalry charge at Chaeronea was now king. He was 20 years old. Can a 20-year-old boy hold together an empire his father built through decades of war and diplomacy?
Alexander stood over his father's body in the theater at Aegae. Blood still pooled beneath Philip's corpse. The white cloak, symbol of peace and unity, had become a death shroud. Around him, chaos, nobles shouting, guards rushing about, guests fleeing in panic. Someone had just assassinated the most powerful man in Greece, and no one knew if the killing would stop with Philip. But Alexander didn't panic. Years of training at his father's side had prepared him for exactly this moment. He immediately took control of the situation with decisive authority that belied his age. He ordered the theater sealed. He summoned the army's commanders. He sent riders to secure strategic locations throughout Macedonia and Greece. Within hours, Alexander had transformed from prince to king. But coronation and control were two different things. Alexander's first challenge came from within his own family. Philip's last wife, also named Cleopatra, had recently given birth to a son, a potential rival heir with powerful relatives and the Macedonian nobility. Philip's most senior general, Attalus, was Cleopatra's uncle. Attalus commanded the advance force already in Asia Minor, which meant he controlled 10,000 veteran troops and could potentially march on Macedonia. Alexander moved with surgical precision. He had Cleopatra and her infant son quietly executed, eliminating rival claimants. He sent assassins to Asia Minor, who killed Attalus before the general could react. He executed or exiled several other nobles suspected of disloyalty. Within weeks, potential rivals had been eliminated or intimidated into submission. The purge was brutal but necessary. Alexander couldn't afford internal opposition while external enemies circled, and those enemies moved quickly. News of Philip's assassination spread across Greece like wildfire. In Athens, Demosthenes appeared in public wearing a laurel wreath and festival clothing, celebrating Philip's death, even though his own daughter had died only days before. He proposed honors for Pausanias, the assassin. The Athenian assembly debated whether to renounce their alliance with Macedonia. Thebes went further than debate. The Thebans expelled the Macedonian garrison Philip had installed and proclaimed their independence. Ambassadors traveled through Greece seeking allies for a general uprising against Macedonian rule. The League of Corinth, that carefully constructed alliance Philip had spent years building, teetered on collapse. In the Balkans, tribes that Philip had subdued saw opportunity in the chaos. The Illyrians, Thracians, and Trebellians prepared for war, sensing that a 20-year-old boy couldn't possibly command the respect and fear that Philip had wielded. But Alexander's response stunned everyone. In the late summer of 336 BC, he marched south into Greece at the head of 3,000 cavalry, moving so fast that most city-states didn't learn he was coming until he was already there. He bypassed Athens, which wisely voted to reaffirm its alliance, and marched straight to Thebes. The Thebans, expecting more time to prepare, found themselves facing Alexander's army outside their walls. Alexander offered terms: surrender, accept Macedonian authority, and face no punishment. The Theban leaders, emboldened by their strong fortifications and remembering the Sacred Band's courage at Chaeronea, refused. They shouldn't have.
Alexander besieged Thebes. His engineers, using techniques Philip had developed, brought siege towers and battering rams against the walls. Macedonian soldiers fought with discipline and ferocity. When a section of wall fell, Macedonian troops poured into the city. What followed was a calculated atrocity. Alexander allowed his soldiers to sack Thebes completely. The city was burned. 6,000 Thebans were killed. 30,000 survivors were sold into slavery. Thebes, one of the greatest cities of Greece, was effectively erased from the map. Only the house of the poet Pindar was spared on Alexander's personal orders, a gesture showing that the young king valued culture even in the midst of destruction. Why such severity? Alexander was sending a message to every city-state in Greece. Rebellion would not be tolerated. Defiance would result not in negotiation or compromise, but in total annihilation. It was a lesson learned from his father. Military force must serve political purposes, and sometimes terror is the most effective tool of statecraft. The message worked. The League of Corinth hastily reconvened and confirmed Alexander as hegemon in his father's place. No city-state dare oppose him. Even Sparta, which remained outside the League, took no action against Macedonian authority. Athens, where Demosthenes had celebrated Philip's death, now sent an embassy apologizing for any perceived disrespect and pledging absolute loyalty to young King Alexander. With Greece secure, Alexander turned north to deal with the barbarian tribes.
In 335 BC, he led a lightning campaign into the Balkans, demonstrating the military brilliance that would make him legendary. He crossed the Danube River, defeated the Getae tribe on the opposite bank, and returned before most Greek city-states realized he had left. Then he marched west against the Illyrians. These mountain warriors had killed Alexander's uncle Perdiccas and 4,000 Macedonians decades earlier, the disaster that had brought Philip to power. Now Alexander would avenge that defeat. The Illyrians held strong defensive positions in the mountains, believing themselves safe. Alexander demonstrated tactical genius beyond his years. He feinted, maneuvered, and used psychological warfare to outthink his enemies. His army moved through supposedly impassable terrain, appeared where the enemy thought impossible, and achieved victory through superior tactics rather than brute force. In less than a year, Alexander had secured his throne, crushed a Greek uprising, destroyed Thebes, and defeated dangerous northern enemies. He had proven himself not merely Philip's son, but a worthy successor, perhaps even a more brilliant commander than his father. But one challenge remained: the invasion of Persia. This was Philip's grand plan, the conquest that would immortalize Macedonia's greatness. Alexander inherited an army prepared for this invasion, a Greek alliance mobilized to support it, and advance forces already across the Hellespont. But did he have the capability to accomplish what even his legendary father had only dreamed of attempting? In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander prepared to find out. He assembled his army at Amphipolis, 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, including the companion cavalry he had led at Chaeronea. The force included not just Macedonians, but contingents from throughout Greece, Thessalian cavalry, Athenian infantry, engineers and specialists from dozens of city-states. The League of Corinth had fulfilled its purpose, Greece united for war against Persia. Before departing, Alexander visited the tomb of the hero Achilles at Troy. According to legend, Achilles had been Alexander's ancestor through his mother's line. Alexander laid a wreath on the tomb and ran naked around it as was traditional. His friend Hephaestion laid a wreath on the tomb of Patroclus, Achilles' companion. The symbolism was deliberate. Like Achilles, Alexander would win immortal glory through war. Like Achilles, he would die young. Unlike Achilles, he would conquer the entire known world. As Alexander's army crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor, leaving Europe behind, the young king stood on the ship's deck looking east toward the rising sun. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the Persian Empire, an empire that dwarfed Macedonia in size, wealth, and population. The Persian king Darius III commanded armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Persian gold could buy alliances, mercenaries, and loyalty. Persian governors controlled territories larger than all of Greece combined. Philip had planned to conquer the western satrapies of the Persian Empire, the regions closest to Greece. It would have been the greatest military accomplishment of his age. Alexander planned to conquer everything. Every satrapy, every province, every city from the Mediterranean to the ends of the earth. He would do what no one before him had even imagined attempting. He would conquer the entire Persian Empire and establish a kingdom that encompassed the entire known world. It was an insane ambition for a 22-year-old king of a relatively small kingdom. It violated every principle of rational strategy and reasonable expectation, which is exactly what Alexander would accomplish over the next 11 years. The Battle of Chaeronea had been the final step in his education. His father had shown him how to win a battle. Now Alexander would show the world how to win an empire. But that's another story. Our story, the story of Chaeronea, ends here, at the moment when the prince became king, when potential became reality, when history pivoted from what was to what would be. Philip II lies in his tomb at Vergina, his one eye closed forever,
his dreams of Persian conquest fulfilled by the son who would surpass him in every way. The Battle of Chaeronea made Alexander's conquests possible. Without that victory on an August afternoon in 338 BC, there would be no Alexander the Great. There would be no Hellenistic age. The course of Western civilization would have flowed in entirely different channels.
Stand on the plain of Chaeronea today, more than 2 millennia later, and you'll find a monument, a stone lion marking where the Sacred Band fell. It was erected by the Thebans who survived, honoring their 300 warriors who refused to break, refused to flee, refused to surrender. Archaeologists excavating the site found the bones of 254 warriors buried beneath it, arranged in 7 rows, lying where they died. That lion tells the story of Chaeronea more eloquently than any historical text. It marked the end of one age and the beginning of another, the end of the classical Greek city-state and the beginning of the Hellenistic kingdoms. It memorializes courage in defeat and honors men who fought for a cause already lost before the battle began. Because here's the truth about Chaeronea: the result was never really in doubt. Philip II had created a military system and a strategic approach that the Greek city-states simply couldn't match. Athens and Thebes weren't defeated because they lacked courage or fighting spirit. The Sacred Band proved otherwise. They were defeated because they were facing the future with the tools of the past. The Greek city-state model, for all its cultural achievements, had fatal military and political weaknesses. City-states were too small to maintain professional standing armies. They relied on citizen soldiers who were farmers and merchants first, warriors second. They made strategic decisions by committee, debating every move in democratic assemblies. They formed alliances that dissolved the moment their immediate crisis passed. They fought wars the traditional way because tradition was more important than innovation. Philip II understood that warfare had evolved. Professional soldiers outperformed citizen militias. Unified command enabled strategic flexibility impossible under committee leadership. Innovative tactics and weapons like the 18-foot sarissa provided decisive advantages. Combined arms tactics integrating infantry, cavalry, and missile troops defeated traditional phalanx formations. Most importantly, long-term strategic planning spanning years or decades accomplished what short-term tactical victories could never achieve. Chaeronea was the moment when this new military reality became undeniable. It wasn't just a battle, it was a demonstration. Philip II showed that one well-trained professional army with unified command could defeat larger forces of citizen soldiers. He showed that tactical innovation trumped traditional methods. He showed that the age of the independent city-state was over. But Chaeronea's significance extends beyond military history. The battle fundamentally altered the political structure of the Greek world. Before Chaeronea, Greece was a system of independent city-states that sometimes cooperated but never unified. After Chaeronea, Greece became part of a larger Macedonian-dominated world. The League of Corinth was superficially a voluntary alliance, but it was really the first step toward empire. This transformation enabled Alexander's conquests. Without unified Greece providing troops, resources, and legitimacy, Alexander couldn't have invaded Persia. Without the administrative and organizational structures Philip developed, Alexander couldn't have governed the territories he conquered. Without the professional army and tactical innovations tested at Chaeronea, Alexander couldn't have defeated the vastly larger Persian forces. The Hellenistic age that followed, when Greek culture spread across the Middle East and Central Asia, when Alexandria became the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world, when Greek philosophy influenced Judaism, Buddhism, and eventually Christianity, all of this traces back to that August afternoon, when Philip's phalanx broke the Athenian line and Alexander's cavalry shattered the Greek center. Yet Chaeronea also reveals the tragedy inherent in historical progress. The Greek city-states that Philip defeated had created democracy, philosophy, theater, and so much of what we value in Western civilization. Athens in particular represented something unique, a society where citizens participated directly in government, where freedom of speech was protected, where intellectual inquiry flourished without religious or political constraint. Thebes had developed military innovations, musical traditions, and philosophical schools. These were societies worth preserving. Philip and Alexander replaced this rich diversity with something more uniform, more efficient, and ultimately less free. The Hellenistic kingdoms that succeeded Alexander were monarchies, not democracies. They were administered by professional bureaucrats, not citizen assemblies. They achieved great things: the Library of Alexandria, advances in mathematics and astronomy, remarkable artistic achievements. But they lost something the classical city-states had possessed: the sense that ordinary citizens controlled their own political destinies. This tension between freedom and order, between local autonomy and centralized efficiency, between traditional independence and modern organization, these tensions define Chaeronea's legacy. Philip didn't just defeat Athens and Thebes, he defeated a particular vision of how human societies should organize themselves. He proved that professional military monarchies could defeat democratic city-states. Whether this was progress or tragedy depends on your perspective. For Philip himself, Chaeronea represented the culmination of his life's work. From the hostage prince studying Theban tactics to the one-eyed king who defeated those same Thebans on the field of battle, Philip's journey embodied determination, strategic brilliance, and ruthless effectiveness. He took Macedonia from a backwater kingdom on the edge of collapse and transformed it into the dominant power of the Greek world. He developed military innovations that would influence warfare for centuries. He created the organizational structures that made Alexander's empire possible.
Yet Philip died before seeing his greatest ambition fulfilled. He never invaded Persia. He never conquered the East. He died at the moment of his greatest triumph, murdered by one of his own bodyguards for reasons we still don't fully understand. There's a dark irony in this: the man who survived countless battles, who had lost an eye to an arrow and walked with a limp from a spear wound, who had faced down the finest warriors of Greece, this man was killed not in glorious combat, but in a theater, stabbed by someone he trusted. The end came not with the clash of bronze shields and thunder of war cries, but with the quiet betrayal of a moment. For Alexander, Chaeronea was his baptism by fire. At 18, commanding cavalry for the first time in a major battle, he performed brilliantly. The charge that broke the Greek center revealed the tactical genius that would make him legendary. But it was more than a move on the battlefield. It was a declaration of identity, a public unveiling of a destiny already forming in the mind of a young man who had been tutored by Aristotle and raised in a court of conquerors. More importantly, fighting alongside his father's veterans, proving himself in the crucible of combat, gave Alexander the credibility he needed when he inherited the throne 2 years later. The officers who fought at Chaeronea became the generals who conquered Persia. The tactics tested at Chaeronea became the tactics that defeated Darius. The confidence gained at Chaeronea enabled Alexander to dream impossibly large dreams, to see not just kingdoms but entire continents as ripe for transformation. For Greece, Chaeronea was the end of an age. The great city-states would continue to exist, would continue to produce philosophy and art and literature, but they would never again control their own destinies. They were provinces in someone else's empire. Athens, the cradle of democracy, would still debate in its assembly and build its temples, but its voice was no longer sovereign. It was subject to the will of a foreign king. Thebes would be rebuilt eventually, but it would never recover its former glory. The Sacred Band was gone forever. Their lion monument stands today not just as a tomb marker, but as a monument to the end of an era, to the final breath of a uniquely Greek way of life. The age of independent Greek city-states, that dynamic, chaotic, brilliant experiment in human organization, was over.
So what does Chaeronea teach us 23 centuries later? First, that military innovation matters. The side that adapts, that develops new tactics and weapons, that thinks creatively about how to organize and employ force, that side wins. Philip Sarissa, his combined arms tactics, his professional army model, these innovations proved decisive. They weren't just military adjustments, but philosophical ones, reimagining what a soldier was, what a phalanx could be, what war might accomplish. Traditionalists always resist change, but history rewards those who embrace it, especially in moments where the old world is becoming the new. Second, that unity provides strength. The Greek city-states individually and even collectively couldn't match Macedonia's unified strategic direction. Democracy has many virtues, but rapid, decisive military action isn't necessarily one of them. This doesn't mean autocracy is morally superior. It means that systems of government carry inherent trade-offs. Freedom has a price. So does order. At Chaeronea, the Greeks fought bravely for a system that ultimately couldn't protect them. The question still echoes today. What's the balance between liberty and security, between choice and survival? Third, that courage isn't always enough. The Sacred Band showed immense bravery. They held the line, fought in unbroken formation, and died to the last man. But courage without effective strategy and tactics leads to honorable defeat, not victory. Wars are won by combining courage with intelligence, valor with innovation, individual heroism with organizational effectiveness. The Sacred Band gives us tragedy, not triumph, a reminder that sometimes the noblest cause is also the most doomed. Fourth, that historical change is often violent and traumatic. The transformation from city-states to empire, from amateur to professional militaries, from distributed to centralized power, this transformation was necessary in some sense, but it came at enormous cost. Progress and tragedy often arrive together, twins bound by the same advance. We celebrate the order that Alexander later brought to Asia, but we must not forget that it began with the burial of Greek freedom under Macedonian boots. Finally, that individual leaders can alter history's course. Philip II's vision, determination, and brilliance transformed not just Macedonia, but the entire Greek world. Without Philip, there is no Alexander. Without Alexander, Greek culture doesn't spread across Asia. Without that cultural diffusion, the intellectual and religious landscape of the ancient world develops differently. One man's ambitions, tested on one August afternoon on the plain of Chaeronea, set in motion events that would shape the art of Rome, the philosophy of Christianity, the science of Islam, and the intellectual DNA of the modern West. The Battle of Chaeronea decided the fate of Greece, but it echoes still in our world. When we visit museums and see Hellenistic sculptures, when we read philosophical texts influenced by Greek thought, when we trace the intellectual heritage of Western civilization, we're seeing consequences of that battle. The world Alexander created after Chaeronea shaped the world we inhabit today. Stand on that plain. Feel the soil beneath your feet. Look at the stone lion marking where the Sacred Band fell. Remember that freedom doesn't always triumph, that courage doesn't guarantee victory, that history flows forward whether we're ready or not. Remember Philip, the eyeless king who reshaped his world. Remember Alexander, the teenage prince who would conquer everything his father had dreamed of and more. Remember the Sacred Band, who died in their ranks, true to their oaths, fighting for a world already lost.
Their story ended at Chaeronea, but the story they created, the story of how the ancient world cracked open and poured into something vast, diverse, and transformative, that story continues still.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.